Thanks for coming today. This is a chance that we've been looking forward to present some of the ideas around a project we're generally calling Problem with Sunshine. It's about accountability generally. It's about hidden votes in Congress. We've been fascinated for a long time. The country's been fascinated in the rise in polarization. People have been pointing as to what it might be. The rise in party line voting in all of our legislatures, in the Congress beginning in the early 1970s and in state legislatures from the mid-1970s to the present, to the point now where we're completely gridlocked. And the three of us have been working on a project to try and understand something fundamental in the nature of how legislation actually works. And we're exploring a vote that happened in 1970, the 1970 Legislative Reorganization Act, that we think changed things dramatically. So the players in this little drama, James and Brent and I, are all part of David King, part of this ongoing dialogue. So we want to start off and show us a couple of slides and frame it for us.
So we've been working on this for about 2 years. It's the first time we're actually talking about it publicly. We don't have a finished paper yet, but some of the data is so compelling that we wanted to just get it out there right away. And a lot of it deals with mythical ideas and misinterpretations that we have. So a lot of the things that we think of congressman is rich or accountability is good, that there's this tremendous and powerful overriding relationship between Congress and people with money. And we're finding that a lot of this, though some of it is true, a lot of it is actually completely the opposite of how it might be interpreted. Even the idea of revolving door politics, which actually gives us very good evidence for some of the stuff we're looking at. So I'm going to drive through some of this. So this traditional congressional narrative, right? So here's our congressman, here's the wealthy outsider, and this is our lobbyist. And this is kind of how we've always, well, at least recently, we've been looking at Congress this way. We've got this idea that Congress serves corporations, this narrative that we hear all the time. But this wasn't true in 1970. So in 1970, this is Lewis Powell, became a Supreme Court justice, worked for the tobacco industry for a long time, was one of many, including the Koch brothers and the father of the Kochs, who were funding Barry Goldwater, doing a number of the similar things they do now, but they were failing. And so this quote is amazing. Business has been the favorite whipping boy of many politicians for years. Current examples of the impotency of business and the near contempt with which businessmen's views are held are the stampedes by politicians to support any legislation related to consumerism. Consumers are the regular folks, they're not corporate people, or the environment. So it's really amazing to think about a world in which this is the view of Congress.
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize that in the Congress literature, those of us who have received our PhDs in the last 30 years, a starting point starts 1972, 73, 74, when a very important wave, a generation of scholars are coming in. David Mayhew, Congress, the Electoral Connection.
Kingdon.
John Kingdon, Richard Fenno. They were examining Congress at this crucial moment just after the reforms that were set in place in the dynamic following this kind of complaint from Lewis Powell. So Congress of the 1960s was a place where there was a lot of socially progressive work going on. The Senate was more retrenched, but the House of Representatives was quite aggressive and pro-consumer, pro-environment. That switched, not on a dime, but maybe on a quarter. It happened pretty quickly. Brent, do you have anything you want to add at this juncture as the story? We also are going to want to hear about Congress.
Sure. So, well, one thing, just to add to the background picture of the difference between the 60s and the 70s and was changing over those periods. So there was a lot of citizen activism in the 1960s. In the 1970s, you saw the rise of public interest advocacy organizations like Common Cause and the Nader organizations that were sort of institutionalizing this progressive political agenda as lobbyists. And they were followed closely Common Cause was founded at the end of 1970, I think, or roughly around that time. In the early 70s, so following closely upon that, you had the Business Roundtable being set up in Washington, D.C., and the Chamber of Commerce becoming sort of the sleeping giant, awakening and getting involved in grassroots and astroturf lobbying in the mid-70s. So you see a large rise in lobbying, and this is something we'll talk more about, in the 1970s, both on the liberal side and on the corporate side. And the liberal lobbying, I mean, the heyday of Common Cause and the NATO organizations was the 70s, and then they sort of were, I don't know if it's right to say they petered out, but they certainly were they were outgunned by the end of the 70s.
Yeah, so getting back to this slide, we see that income inequalities, the lowest at any time in the country's history. These green quotes are actually from Dark Money. So they're very fascinated with this period that we're living in almost a economic utopia for the common man. And we see this. It drops in 1938 and stays down, and it's just laying there flat until, as we see here in the graph, 1970, 1973. Just to comment on what Brent was saying, we know that Lee Drutman, who's the specialist on sort of special interests, claims that the rise of lobbying, modern lobbying, began, and he says exactly in 1970. So it's very important things to think about. So corporate America was in trouble. The late 1960s and early 1970s were in fact a daunting time for corporate America and for those living off great corporate fortunes. We can all think of names that we can fill in there. The business community was reeling from the birth of the environmental and consumer movement. It's just shocking to think about, right? That the common man is just dominating. I mean, the fact that they care more about the environment and more about the consumer than even the people themselves do, it seems. Congress was very aggressive. So now we're starting to get a picture of what we're going to be talking about. This right here is a drawing because we can't have any photos of what we're talking about because photographers were not allowed inside the committees in 1970. So I've started to develop these drawings with a friend of mine, and this is a committee. And most committees have 11 people. And so in the committee room in 1970, when you would discuss health care, tobacco, oil, energy, race, anything that you were writing in committee, any legislation that you were piecing together looked like this, in a room like this. And as David pointed out the other day, where were the lobbyists? Well, they were in the lobby, right? That's exactly where lobbyists were. And these guys were literally trying to peek through the keyhole, look under the door, do whatever they could to find out who in there they could take out because they were writing legislation against them. But it wasn't so easy. If you've been to Longworth Building, where some of the committee rooms were, etc. These are thick, old doors, the gummed up keyholes, all that. Maybe the congressmen were actually putting stuff in there. And then clearly they could turn their back and whisper or do whatever they want. So this is the way laws were written in 1970.
I just want to say it's also the way that laws have been written throughout American history.
Correct.
That the committees were places where it was assumed you needed the privacy to be able to work out deals with each other.
Negotiate.
It's hard to negotiate in public because when you have a public there, you're performing for them as opposed to performing for each other. And so sunshine is a great disinfectant, but sunshine can also destroy things. And that's the balance that we've been trying to understand over the years, is how much transparency is good and how much transparency will ultimately become destructive. In the context of 1970, of course, we've talked about consumerism, environmentalism, but the other great moment of time was what was happening in Vietnam. And decisions were taking place in committee rooms and on the floor, especially of the House, in something called the Committee of the Whole. And lobbyists couldn't monitor it, and the American public couldn't monitor it. And it was in that moment that people wanted to know, where did you stand? Where did you stand on civil rights? Where did you stand on the Vietnam? And politicians could have it both ways. They could say one thing in private, and then in public claim that they had been quite heroic. So there was a strong incentive for for lobbyists and also for the public to know what are they talking about behind those closed doors. And this begins the process of ushering in the reforms.
So, yeah, so as he alluded to, even from the writing of the Constitution, so the Continental Congress, the, what do you call the one where they wrote the Constitution? Constitutional Convention, to Kennedy, to LBJ, we don't know a single vote of John F. Kennedy as he's writing amendments or voting in committees. We don't know a single one, nor of James Madison, nor of LBJ when they were serving in Congress. And that's 99, maybe 95% for sure of the voting that took place. We don't have the full count of all the possible votes that took place because they were secret. But we're talking an inordinate difference between what hits the floor. So if you saw the Lincoln movie, that's a floor vote. Floor votes have been public throughout history. There's about 200 per session, so 100 per year. We're talking thousands and thousands of votes per session that are secret. And as we'll get to later, the committee votes are the difficult votes for a congressperson. The floor votes are the easy votes. Easy in the sense that they almost are meaningless. And I won't go that far, but it's close. We're close to being able to say.
There's also a good reason for this. At the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, when they're drafting this, of course it was very hot, but they were worried about anybody listening in and trying to undo whatever compromises that they were going to put together. They shut the windows in the hottest days of the year and stayed inside. The reason that they shut the windows is they didn't want anyone standing outside listening in, because you can't negotiate sensitive, important changes to public policy in a public setting. You need to have a cloak that's a place where you can be in confidence with each other. And so what do we think about legislation that is crafted largely in secret and then the final vote is taken in public? Well, it can be problematic, because how do we know how to monitor the activities of the members of Congress or of your state legislators? You can't monitor everything that they're doing. There has to be an element of trust, a level of trust. Today, there's very little trust in government, and it's hard to imagine a time when most of the country was perfectly happy allowing their legislators to operate in complete secrecy until the final vote. But that level of trust was very important.
Yeah, and the Founding Fathers were called the evil geniuses of darkness, as they were writing some of the stuff by some people. But George Washington was adamant. Security at front and back of the door. I believe they even covered the windows. And they got this actually from the Stuarts in England, which the Parliament there was having troubles dealing with the king. The king was intimidating legislators who were trying to spend money differently than how the king wanted to spend. And the king would intimidate the individual legislators, and they weren't able to control the money. So they actually closed the door in the first committees of the whole in the 1700s, early 1600s, Stuarts, England. So this is something they ported over wholesale and used up until 1970 when that was ripped open. And so it's interesting to think about the relationship, right? If you're going to go to vote secretly on an organization, you are kind of a bit like a superhero. There was no congressman being taken out by a special interest in 1969. They didn't come after you, right? Because what's going to happen? Group theory suggests if big oil takes out one congressman, all the other congressmen are going to say, well, you don't respect congressmen. And they're going to be pretty unhappy with you. So there was a huge respect between big oil or these big companies and the congressmen. They were not trying to take you out in public. So these congressmen became really kind of glamorous people. They were like superheroes. You know, they'd go into the barbershop, kids would run up and say hello. And this is the relationship that would happen right at the door, right when the congressman's about to go in and write legislation. Right? The lobbyists would beg. You couldn't make a threat. You'd go, please, you understand what I've been trying to talk to you about. This is what I really need from you. Please, come on, that would be great. And so this relationship was a very different relationship than what we see these days. And so then they installed the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1970, which was what we're talking about. And here it says, It was an act of the United States Congress to improve the operation of the legislative branch of the federal government and for other purposes.
Yeah, it's that for other purposes that we've been so interested in. And Brent, give us a little bit of the history here.
Sure, well, okay, a little bit of the history. So, the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1970 covered a lot of ground, covered different aspects of the running of Congress. The parts that were connected with transparency had to do with several things. One was opening up committees, which James has already referred to, and in the long run, that may have been the most significant of the changes, arguably. Another was recording of votes in committees, which James referred to already as well. Previously, they had gone unrecorded. A third was the broadcast of proceedings on the floor and in committee. The Legislative Reorganization Act authorized Congress and committees to provide for that, to allow television cameras into the rooms where they were doing business. It made provisions for electronic voting, which introduces the possibility of seeing on large boards how the voting is proceeding from moment to moment. James will have more to say about that soon. And finally, the recording of teller votes in the Committee of the Whole, which David was just referring to. And that last one was the one that was the most contentious at the time. It was significant at the time. It did have significant effects. And just to clarify what that means, so in the Committee of the Whole, when the whole Congress, or the whole House of Representatives, rather, is debating legislation that's reported from a committee and amending it, the House uses some streamlined procedures. And so votes are taken either by voice vote or standing vote, or what's called a teller vote, which is basically a head count. People actually line up and they walk down the aisle and they're counted. The yeses first and then the noes. In all three of those procedures, voice, standing, and teller vote, historically no record was taken of who voted how. If you were in the gallery, or if you were on the floor and you were watching an individual, you could see how they voted because they passed down the aisle at one line or the other.
And if you were in the gallery, you're not allowed to take notes.
Right.
Because they didn't want anyone to know exactly who's voting how on these amendments.
So it's sort of a twilight area between transparency and openness. If you are paying close attention, you can see how a handful of people are voting and remember it and take notes later. But as far as the public goes, it's closed. It's the
Right,
the
so it's
public
important to
isn't.
realize the Committee of the Whole is a very peculiar committee. So most of the committees you've seen pictures of with these little 11 people are not the Committee of the Whole. So the public wasn't allowed in those at all. There's maybe only a handful in history that we found where outsiders were allowed in. The Committee of the Whole has always been in the main chamber, and so you did have the galleries. You weren't allowed to take notes, but people tried to figure out those votes, and there was a lot of contention based around their ability to view those votes. So even the fact that you could report them, say, oh, I saw this guy vote this way, it was often contended anyway. So there's something really beautiful about not even having an official record, right? The congressman could deny it, lie, and say he voted the other way, or maybe the person got it wrong. They were doing, as some people mentioned, drive-by shooting of the tellers. So they would vote one way, then the congressman would go by later and go, switch my vote, and just whisper it. It was very hard to tell how they were voting. So even for the leaders, it's not clear that the people sitting there, the other congressmen, could know exactly how members are voting on sensitive issues.
And this was part of the impetus for putting these
Yes.
transparency provisions in the
Exactly.
Legislative Reorganization Act. That, as David was referring to, the Vietnam War was a contentious issue at the time. The leadership of both the Democrats and the Republicans colluded to prevent a record vote. There were a lot of members of Congress who wanted to put themselves on record for their constituents saying, I'm voting against continuation of the Vietnam War. So there were members of Congress who wanted for that reason to put themselves on record. And there were journalists and others in the gallery trying to find workarounds to get a record of who was voting how, and sometimes getting it wrong, or appearing to get it wrong. We don't know if they did or not. So that was part of the reason why at this particular time this was on the agenda. One other thing to say about the LRA of 1970, some of these transparency provisions were in the bill that was reported from the Rules Committee. Others were added during the debate of the Legislative Reorganization Act on the floor in the Committee of the Whole. And so there was a floor fight to strengthen the transparency provisions of the Act.
So two things I think there's one little tiny thing they added as well. They said, we will also require 3 days advance notice of any legislation to be discussed. So if congressmen were particularly sensitive about certain issues and they wanted to get it done without the lobbyists there, they would do it right then and there. But, you know, the outsiders really hated that they wanted 3-day advance notice so they could prepare their army to go and meet these congressmen on the issue. So the 3-day advance notice I actually think is a pretty big deal in that as well.
And of course, it's not just the lobbyists who are pushing for this, it's the reporters as well. So a journalist would love to have a sense for what's coming 2 or 3 days down the pike.
Yeah, and so the one final note on this is the word transparency and this act are almost, they seem unrelated in history. You almost never see the word transparency put next to this act in any document. And this is maybe the transparency motherlode of all time. So there's a lot of people who write about the history of transparency and leave this act out entirely, right? It clearly, if you have the Government and the Sunshine Act, you know what you're talking about. That happened in '76. Or FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, right? If this was just called the Legislative Reorganization Act, we're going to change the way Congress works. And the word transparency and accountability were not associated in these discussions. So it's very interesting to see how easily this could be left out of a discussion about how things might have changed. So the lobbyists really enjoyed this piece of legislation. We don't know how much they wanted it at the time. It's hard to know what's in the hearts of men, as Conrad once said. But this is the change. Right, so this is the open committee. So let's go back. Here's the lobbyists. Here's the open committee. This is an enormous change to the way things happen. I mean, we could spend the rest of the day talking about the dynamics that change in just this one moment. All the things that might not be said or proposed or suggested now in these committee rooms when it's, as we know, it's often all one group of lobbyists, even though this is an open or public group. Why do we know that? Well, because you don't buy the seats. Those are free for anyone to go get.
Yeah, it's much like jury duty, right? Or you know, it's much like going in and watching a court. There can be the trial of the century, and maybe you want to go in and you have to wait in line. And everybody, what if you had a trial in which only one type of witness was able to even be there, and that's what happens because of these rooms. So you can pay to have somebody stand in line for you to get in and watch what actually happens in these committee hearings or in these committee meetings. It's open, but who's actually there? Remember, anytime you're negotiating or having a conversation, the dynamic changes if there's an audience. Well, if the audience is just lobbyists and a couple of journalists, it's going to be a very different kind of conversation than if it's us as friends and we've been talking for a long time and working on these programs for years.
There's at least one case that we found of a climate-based committee where not a single climate activist was able to get a seat. And so it was all big oil, big coal, you name it, that controlled that. They bought the seats, or they hired linestanding.com and others to hold that place 3 days in advance. That's $40 an hour, minimum 3 hours per person. So they're willing to pay. So when people talk about access, how come they never mention this? This is access. And as we mentioned, it's committee votes. Talking committee used to be free-flowing. Negotiation would happen pretty openly. Floor votes have always been traditionally easy because if you're voting on a big piece of legislation, well, they're not easy, but they're easier than a committee vote. A committee vote, you're writing the exact line that's being said. So you're going to say, big oil can't do this, one line. And you're going to maybe vote on amending that into the bill. Right? That is very difficult, very specific, and big oil is watching exactly the people who are doing that. Once that makes it to the floor, that one line can be packaged with thousands or even 1 million other lines. I don't know how big a 1,600-page bill is, how many lines it is, but it's a lot of lines. And that line can now be hidden against other things that might serve your community or work against constituents. So
It's a lot easier to explain your vote if it's part of a big,
Right,
if you're
with
voting
all
on a big
these
bill. There are
different
lots
things.
of things in the bill, lots of reasons to vote yes or no.
Give me wiggle room and I can explain it, that's right, in a very large, an omnibus is an easy thing to vote for because there's always plenty of reasons to actually, you can point to that, I like that part, I couldn't, I didn't.
And omnibus voting took off.
Right, but in the, an omnibus voting bills can take off, right. The committee votes are much more difficult because that is where legislation actually gets crafted. And then the committee leadership is seen as a cue when you get onto the floor. So they're cue givers and the cue takers are going to follow what happened out of the relevant people in the committees. Another thing that's interesting in this little graph is they're sitting around a regular shaped table. Well, along the same period, the shape and size of committee rooms changes dramatically. It's
Sure.
no longer a table. It becomes an open U in which you're now facing an audience. The table that you see right there,
Exactly.
that's how Congress operated for most of American history. But now that they have an audience, they're facing out and they're not facing each other. So the committee room that you're used to seeing these days is not the committee room that your grandparents knew. And of course, the dynamic in that committee is completely different as well.
Great point. Great. That's so true. And so, what's important to think about is that the relationship between Congress and the outside changed immediately, right? So immediately, you have outside special interests with power who are now looking over and standing over the congressman and telling them exactly what they would like to see done in these rooms. All right, we remember the previous one where the congressman's the superhero standing over the poor lobbyist who is begging. Well, here, the congressman doesn't even need to talk. All his actions are suddenly public. He doesn't say, hey, I'm going to go in there and fight like a tiger for you, is what they would say in 1969. Now he just comes out and listens to the outsider with lots of power, telling him exactly how he needs to act, or else. And the or else is almost always some form of intimidation. Intimidation is something we follow very closely because we think it's actually much, much more influential than any form of bribery or any form of money injections. Okay, so intimidation is based on negative advertising or taking someone out or running legislation that's going to burn them to their constituents, and we'll get into some of that later. But the ability to threaten based on votes has its birth, basically, in 1970. And now, who thinks of congressmen in any form as superheroes? We look at these poor, downtrodden, beat-up individuals who are picked apart at every turn, and this is part of that relationship that's changed. So, again, a lot of these myths that we've run into is, everyone talks about more accountability, how accountability is great. We find accountability to be the most undemocratic of all events. Accountability is linearly related to power. I don't have a date on that, but it seems to express power in every way. So the more power you have, the more you can use accountability. The less power you have, think of myself, for example, I can't go to a congressman and tell him how to vote. I can't threaten how to vote. I can't use a big stick. There is no big stick that I have. So accountability, which comes directly from transparency, is almost always a sanction, and it's a sanction that can be applied by those with the most power. Certainly citizen groups can do this, but they have to organize and become a special interest that wields power themselves. But we certainly know that big groups, big companies can go and basically give a laundry list of all the votes they'd like to see on many different issues, whereas a citizen group can usually only get one or two issues handled because of the power that these big groups have. And so the word accountability, whenever I see it, it just, we want more accountability. You want to raise money to solve Congress, put more accountability and more transparency, this feedback loop that's actually benefiting. Again, I've never seen a special interest complain about too much accountability or too much transparency. I've never seen it in my life. This is their bread and butter.
Yeah, think about it from your own point of view. Like, how do we hold our own elected officials accountable? Well, we don't have a whole lot of tools. Maybe we can handle a little bit of money here and there or go campaign for them. That would be great. It's at the ballot box. It's every 2 years, or in some cases every year, where you can go and say, on balance, no. Or on balance, yes. But those who can monitor what's happening in a legislature at a micro level, who are in the committee rooms, who have that kind of time, they have accountability, right? And now the members have to become accountable to them, because they come with a list. Where are you on this? Where are you on these 7 issues? Oh, I heard what you said, and I took down I noticed what you said on TV, and don't think we're not going to remember that. Right? So there's a lot of, and then you're gonna basically work for my benefit. So accountability is a much more of a fiction than you think it is, and transparency has made this kind of corruption so obvious that it's transparent. We don't even notice that it's happening right in front of us. Transparency is another name often for corruption.
If I could put it another way, the transparency provides accountability, but it doesn't say who you're accountable to, and the difference between open voting and secret voting is that in secret voting you're asking the people who are doing the voting to use their own best judgment. If you set up voting to be open voting, then you're asking the people who are doing the voting to navigate a field of forces that are holding them accountable to pulling them in different directions. There's hardly a contest when it comes to the kinds of pressures that Congresspeople are.
In a vast majority of the transparency literature that I see, they claim that transparency is delivered to the people. Transparency is delivered to the people. Every time you hear that, the accountability helps the people.
Accountability is, but people use the word, it's assumed to mean public accountability.
Right, we've left out entirely perhaps the main consumers of the transparency, which are the people in power. Right, I spoke to some people who work for FOIA. They're like, we've got 650,000 requests this year. And I said, is it possible that 640,000 of those come from special interests? And I said, yeah, it actually is. It's possible. And so when you see the analysis of transparency, they're always like, we're delivering this to the people. You can't, as soon as you deliver it to the people, prevent it from going to special interests and those in power who are able to wield the biggest hammer and make the biggest change on legislation. Right, so as soon as you open that, you've made the system completely undemocratic. You've tilted everything toward power. And what's interesting is here we've talked about the outside relationship, and this is the relationship we looked at right at the beginning. What's really actually the most amazing that we're finding is that a phenomenal amount of the corruption takes place entirely without outside special interests. So since 1970, by opening up the voting to the people around you. So I always like to say, who does a pigeon hate the most? You know, everyone's like, oh, the cat, the fox, or whatever. Pigeon usually hates a pigeon the most, right? They're the ones going to peck the back of their head the most, right? As soon as you open up the votes, it gives other members of Congress new powers to work against you. And I'm sure you want to talk about what these torpedo amendments are, or you want to address these?
Sure. So a torpedo amendment would be introducing an amendment for consideration and a vote, not because you think it's a good idea or even that you think it has a chance of passing, but to force somebody else in the chamber to take a public stand on that topic that will embarrass them either way, or the way that you and they know that they have to vote.
It's so prevalent that overwhelmingly a majority of the amendments that we see in state legislatures are of this variety. They're to take a stand to try and prove something to an external audience, never anticipating it's going to pass, or to try and put the opposite party in a difficult place. The overwhelming majority of amendments now are not for shaping legislation, but for shaping perception of the other.
And we see this in the data as well. So the number of amendments hits a all-time high at 1,800 per session in 1978, and they just completely overwhelmed. So even though I'm writing an amendment to take you out, for example, every congressman now has to vote on it because the public's saying, make sure they vote on everything, make sure they're doing their job. And so they went from voting on 200 things or on the floor a year to 1,800 per session, right? So they're losing half their life now to voting on legislation that no one intended to pass. right? If I know in your constituency you're having troubles with gambling, right, it's going to divide your constituency, I'm going to write an amendment on gambling so that now you will publicly vote on gambling. Then your opponent can take you out in the election based on that specific vote that you made. Those types of amendments would not be written at all under secrecy. They had no effect. They were worth nothing.
Yeah, and you remember the old saying, right, that two things you don't want to see made are laws and sausage. And so what happens in the 70 Act is now we can see how the sausage is made. And one might think, well, maybe we'll be better consumers of sausage and we won't eat such lousy food. That's not what happened. In this case, when you see how the sausage is made, it actually ruins the sausage. So it's ruined the process in important ways.
So again, we're going through 7 mechanisms that take place inside that require no outside money at all. So imagine we solve all the campaign finance problems in the world. These forms of corruption that we believe could account for almost all the corruption in Congress won't be affected at all. Almost no one considers the fact that this corruption is really driven internally, the pigeon to the pigeon. This one is the Speaker Party Leader Power, and you probably cover this about as well as anybody when I talk to you. Do you want to go over that?
Well, in order to get a position on a committee, you need to be in a good position with the Speaker. And the Speaker's able to monitor your behavior in remarkable detail. So the Speaker and the party leader become the major cue givers that you have to line up behind. And you're completely exposed. Now, the Speaker and the party leader would often know roughly how you were going to vote when it was in secret, but now the leadership is the absolute consumer of this. So you want to be on the right committees, you better vote in line. You want to move ahead, you better vote in line. And beginning in the early 1970s, we see this dramatic increase in party line voting. Party unity goes way up. Why? Well, because they have to march in lockstep with the leadership on these now very public kinds of proclamations that don't have a lot to do with actual lawmaking.
Yeah, and so, to get your legislation put on the floor, you've just been elected to office, you think you're going to change the way things are going, you immediately find yourself giving away all your votes just to get your legislation on the floor, just to get a position in committee. Within 2 months, you go from idealistic to feeling like a prostitute, right? So we don't see a lot of pushback from congressmen when they're called corrupt, etc., because they're really feeling this. And this is the stuff that happens internally inside. So if you want to get your stuff on the floor, you've got to start giving away 78, 80% of your votes to start to buy that time on the floor. Clearly, this isn't something you would do if that voting was all secret.
And with electronic voting, it's very easy for the leadership to.
Right, the Speaker, instead of looking at this little board, will type your name in and see that you voted 49% of the time with them or 80% of the time against them or whatever, and they will assign committee seats based on that. And we've got news articles, John Boehner literally standing in front of the news journalist saying, I hope you're all watching, Congress, about how you're voting on this because we assign committee seats. What is he saying? He's saying vote the way I intend for you to vote or you won't be on that committee, which means you won't get reelected because I'm not going to give you the perks that make you a successful member of Congress.
That's right.
So David started to mention this. This is a big deal. He studied partisanship for a long time. But one thing that I think is pretty interesting is that once you have an open committee, once you have an open anything, you get this immediate partisanship. And this quote came from a legislative director of a current U.S. senator. And he wrote me because he had found out about some of the work. And he said, the only committees where members negotiate are the closed-door committees. As soon as the doors are closed, everyone starts to figure out how to build a solution. As soon as the doors are open, everyone hardlines. It's coming from the legislative director of a U.S. senator, big, powerful one, right? And so as soon as the doors are closed, you get legislation that's starting to reflect the whole group. As soon as it's open, you get a very partisan, everyone is on some other side.
Yeah, and you'll see committees where they'll be open for some parts of a session, then they'll take a break. The classic is the bio break. Okay, we're gonna take a bathroom break now. And where can members hide from staffers and from journalists and from lobbyists? In members-only restrooms. So you'll find, say, a conference committee or part of a conference committee. They go in a bio break. Doesn't matter if it's a women's bathroom or a men's bathroom. It's a members-only bathroom. They file in, they cut a deal, and come out and in public then actually get it done. But you can't negotiate when the doors are completely wide open because, again, negotiation dies in sunshine. It's harder, much harder.
Right, and so you're literally forced to have a firm, hard, fixed party line stance on everything, which is why these days we get all our military budgets tied to our views on schooling and abortion, and all of that goes hand in hand. So if you don't agree with me on schools, well, that changes how we're going to work on the military, right? Everything's hardline. So the putting together of all these ideas into one box dedicated as liberal and one box dedicated as Republican makes things very, very rigid. So here's some of the data on this. We've got a few different graphs that we'll be hitting you with. This is party difference on special rules. It's pretty easy to see when they start to change on these things. You'll see this in graph after graph after graph after graph that something changes in the 1970s. I know you're interested in unions. We know that unions start to really die in 1970. There's earlier stuff, the 1934 Taft-Hartley, et cetera, but you see just an amazing difference. And every time you see the turn, it's going to be tilting toward either a partisanship sort of thing or where it's disregarding the will of the people. And we see that pretty clearly.
This is from David Roding. The other element that I want to mention here about how we look at party differences and party scores. One way of looking at it is the percentage of time that, say, 80% of one party is voting against 80% of another. So you see that dramatically going up after 1970. Another, though, looking at party difference is based on something called DW nominate scores, Poole and Rosenthal, and this scaling technique that takes a look at every vote that is recorded in a legislature and jumbles it all into a fabulous set of algorithms. And you see a dramatic increase in polarization and partisanship after 1970. But what that misses is the reality that before 1970 we didn't actually have votes except for final passage votes. And we treat DW nominate and so many of these scaling techniques as if they're sacrosanct and they reflect everything that's ever happened in American history. But what we are fundamentally measuring changes in 1970. And so a lot of our analysis is just built on this odd foundation that clearly must have some problems. And again, to the extent that the congressional literature grew up around Mayhew, Fenno, and Kingdon, it's all built in this entirely new era that had rammed into it the seeds of this polarization.
Right, there's very little, very few studies that look at both sides and start to compare. I don't know of any. So looking at Congress before and after and this massive change. So there's a lot of correlations that you can start to play with, and we're not going to say that transparency causes this, but it starts to look provocative that when you immediately start to benefit the very wealthy, that things are going to affect the very poor and the middle class dramatically. This is a set of graphs. It's very common in the literature, so you see a lot of people analyzing the correlations between polarization and income inequality.
And the shout out here goes to Nolan McCarty of Princeton. And but the causal mechanism in Nolan McCarty's work is not all that clear. It empirically seems to be the case that as inequality increases, polarization increases. But we think we have a better explanation for why they found that result.
So I think we even have the dates here. So here's 73, here's 70, 78, here's 83. So you see it all just kind of moving up from there. And you can pick your own point, but you're going to start to see these very similar transitions in a lot of places. And inequality, I believe, is a really important issue. I think it drove a lot this campaign that we just recently had with the Trump voters being pushed a lot by other reasons, clearly, but inequality is now been cited even by some of the economics professors here at Harvard as the driving force behind the election of Donald Trump. So, you know, a lot of candidates have run throughout history on racism and all this other stuff and never have gotten anywhere. But Trump was speaking to a number of voters who voted for Obama in 2008 that come from very poor counties that are now voting for Trump. So it's interesting, and this is underlined here by this is the growth of wages and productivity. This is the Bureau of Labor Statistics, U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, and again, you just keep seeing these elbows at 1970 that are just phenomenal. The small graph shows the earnings of American males, who again were a big driving force in the election of Trump. Their wages have been flat since 1970. All right.
Right. And when we hear arguments, a very common argument about why there's income inequality these days is that productivity is really hurting the traditional American worker, right? So an Amazon distributing factory is basically run by a bunch of robots. So people are becoming ever more efficient and then they're displaced from the labor force. Well, we've had a fairly monotonic increase in productivity over time, yet this gap in wages begins at this odd elbow point that we keep finding, that is 1970 or the early 1970s. So it was the case beginning in the post-World War II era that productivity was increasing, but so were wages at the same rate. What happens in 1970? Well, importantly, public policy changed in 1970. It's not merely the dynamic of how the economy is structured or the invention of the microchip. Public policy and U.S. tax policy changed during the 1970s and then really take off in the 1980s.
Exactly, and there's a couple of people that work on this pretty heavily. You have Hacker and Pearson write their book. The entire book is basically claiming that this turn in 1970 was delivered by Congress, was delivered by the laws, not by anything else that people are talking about. And they work really hard to show this, but they say, and we might see a slide later if we have time, they say that at least one third of the current income inequality situation can be defined by just changes in the tax code since 1970. And you have other scholars in other places claiming there are other forms of legislation change that drove this inequality shift. So these are big deals. Here's wages, here's 1970 right here, and we see how badly they've been since 1970. So this is likely going to be your Trump voter right down here. You know, it's certainly possible. That's what we've been seeing. Here's the income inequality graph. Feel free to jump in. I'm just going to get through. So
I want to turn back to Brent's conversation about where this actually came from. We mentioned that it was in the Vietnam era that this emerges, but who was the mastermind behind making this public?
His name is Richard Conlon.
Yeah.
So the question is, well, why did Congress do it? Why did the Congress do it at this time? Who thought it would be a good idea, and did they were these intended or unintended consequences? But in the late 60s, you had two factions. So when I said there was a floor fight, for example, over some of the amendments to the Legislative Reorganization Act, there were two factions. There was the older members of Congress who had the power, and the younger members of Congress who didn't have the power, who wanted more power. The Democrats had controlled Congress for decades. Many of the insurgents were younger Democrats, liberal Democrats, who were locked out of power. So one important thing about the way Congress worked back then, they had what was called the seniority system, where your position in a committee was based on how long you'd been serving in Congress, how long you'd been serving on that committee. Because the Old South, because the Republican Party was not competitive in the Old South, the conservative Democrats who came to Congress from the Old South floated to the top over the course of decades. So they controlled most of the committees. The liberal, younger, newer members of the Democratic Party, along with many of the younger members of the Republican Party, were pushing for reform. In the case of the transparency amendments, it was Richard Conlon, who was the staff director of the Democratic Study Group, which was the caucus of the liberal Democrats in the House.
So the Democratic Study Group is not the Democratic Party?
That's correct. So the Democratic Party, under McCormick and Albert, had relatively weak leadership. They let the committee chairs, which were basically Southern Democrats, run the show in Congress.
And the Democratic Study Group ends up having tremendous leverage. How?
Well, what Conlon's idea was, which turned out to be a brilliant stroke, was to say, well, let's take all this large package of reforms, including these 10 amendments that we'd really like to include in the reform bill, and let's sell it as anti-secrecy because the press will eat that up. And Congress was a former journalist himself, and he was right. So many newspapers ran with Congress is trying to reform itself, working to eliminate secrecy from its proceedings. And it was an effective outsider campaign to get to put pressure on members from their hometown newspapers, from constituents who were paying attention.
Well, Conlon understood that if they make the teller votes public, he would be able to hold every single one of those members accountable, not to the Democratic Party generally, but to the liberal faction of the Democratic Party that he was now running. And Conlon was a lobbyist. Now, he's a lobbyist who had an office right there in Capitol Hill. He was brilliant and very well respected, but contemporaries called this act the Full Employment Act for lobbyists. It's not simply transparency or anti-secrecy. This becomes the Full Employment Act. And unintended consequences have been spilling out ever since.
Right. Yeah. So to build on a couple of those points, so this was about younger members versus older members. It was also a coup for the liberal Democrats. Conlon appears to have understood what he was doing. He said there wasn't unintended consequence, an intended consequence. That at least in a couple of ways. One is that if the votes were recorded, they counted on members' voting records, so there was an incentive for the liberal members who otherwise might not have shown up for votes in the committee of the whole, because they knew the committee chairs were going to get their way anyway. There was an incentive for the younger members, the liberal members, to show up and therefore exercise their numerical strength. The liberals were the majority of the Democratic Party, and so it was a way to get the liberals to exercise their numeric strength. It was also a way to hand power to the liberals' lobbyist friends. And we're talking labor, education. Conlon called meetings for lobbyists to tell them, these are the reforms we're pushing for, help us with this, it'll help you.
This is going to benefit you.
Right.
They're literally holding meetings with the
sources
lobbyists.
at the Times talked about 3 evening meetings that Conlon held for lobbying groups, and it was a bipartisan effort, so they invited the Chamber of Commerce to come to these meetings as well. The Chamber of Commerce told the journalists, we see this as an internal matter for Congress, we're not really interested in it. But the labor folks, the education folks, they got on board and they put their weight behind it to get this reform passed. And they understood, and we were talking about people standing in line and packing the committee room. Common Cause in the early 70s, they took advantage of these reforms. They would have an intern sitting in the committee room, and if anything went not according to their playbook, they'd run out of the room, grab a phone. They didn't have cell phones back then. They'd grab a phone and call the leadership of Common Cause to say, you need to get down here, get in the committee room, and hold these people's feet to the fire.
So we are coming to an end of our time, our window for now. But this is an exciting line of research, and for those of you who haven't been studying the Congress literature for most of your adult life, it's important to understand just how different this kind of argument actually is. A big change happened that is that ushered in an entirely new era. And it's that new era that somehow becomes the set point for us to understand Congress currently in graduate schools. Transparency appears to be a beautiful thing, and everyone argues on behalf of transparency, but the people who benefit the most from it are those who can monitor the most closely. Members can no longer have these private conversations in which they're thinking about the public good and talking about, you know, you take a little pain, you take a little pain, we'll all take a little pain, but we're all going to be better off. Now they're playing to a very public audience, and it's destroyed some of these individual relationships. And Congress as an institution is in worse shape, far worse shape now than it's been in generation upon generation. And so the Reform Act set in process a sequence of events that has helped to destroy the legislative integrity and usefulness of Congress. So where we go from here, we have to continue telling this story, button it up. There's a paper that I think you can find off the link on this website that James has here on, is it called YouTube? These new fancy things.
No, it's Congressional Research.
Congressionalresearch.org. So we're working on that, and we need to think as well, and need your help thinking through how to have a deliberative process in a legislature where people can negotiate and yet not give it all out in public. We need to create strengthened spaces for people to have conversations and get things done. Any closing thoughts and comments?
I think it's just interesting to note that this change did occur in 1970 without there is no research that supports transparency. We haven't found any. So I've been looking at this for 2 years. We haven't found anything that documents why this might be a good thing, and we found nothing since. The only paper out there that even sort of pushes transparency along is 2014 by Brookings, which cites the beginning of transparency as 1986. So you'll see in their big graph pre-transparency and post-transparency, and of course not much correlates with 1986 because they completely missed the boat. And it's just how incredible this whole argument is that you'll see even big scholars say, well, of course transparency is good. And I'm looking for the citation, right? We have no research that's ever suggested, there was no evidence in any other country that this was working. And it's really phenomenal how many states and countries jumped on this bandwagon as a result of the United States. The most recent is France, turned in 2014. Italy goes in 1993, and then more in 1998. You have all sorts of countries all over the world, and now the discussion again for these other countries is to increase transparency. And so when I saw Brazil in crisis a few years ago, it was so amazing to see all the members of parliament down there, and behind was the most beautiful screen you've ever seen showing how they were voting.
Yeah.
And it was just gorgeous. I mean, this screen was just a tiny little LED lights, perfect, and just really just right on top of them. And if you're in a state legislature, you'll see all of the state legislators looking up at the board as they're trying to figure out how they're going to vote, and all those pressures that happen. So we're putting it out there. It's interesting to talk about. Yeah.